America.
Hi there, this is Power in Politics. I'm David Cochran in Ottawa, where any moment now, the federal government will outline its plan to protect kids from online harms. We're standing by to take you live to the minister responsible for that, Mark Miller, who will lay out what is in his new digital safety bill. And later, Minister Miller will join me here in the studio. Plus, there's new trouble on the U.S. trade front as President Donald Trump says he's not interested in renewing CUSMA.
Well, I'm not looking to renew it. We don't need anything that Canada has. We don't need anything that Mexico has, but they need everything that we have.
And one day after saying the Gordie Howe Bridge will open this week, the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, now says it could be delayed.
Everyone's working hard to make sure the bridge is open as soon as possible. There's no big drama. If it takes a little longer, it'll take a little longer.
President Trump once threatened to block the bridge. What happens if he follows through? The Power panel is standing by with their take as Power in Politics starts right now. Okay, we're going to start with these new measures to protect Canadians, especially children, young Canadians, from online harms. The Minister of Culture, Mark Miller, is set to make that announcement any minute now, going through the measures in the legislation. The digital safety legislation includes a ban on social media for kids under 16. There are also new rules for AI chatbots. The CBC's Karina Roman joins me now in the studio to walk us through what we know at this point, because Karina, government officials just delivered a tech briefing ahead of the minister's press conference. Walk us through what the highlights are of this bill.
So in terms of the ban that we all were expecting, it is a ban for kids under 16 in terms of social media, not in terms of chatbots, but it's really more of a moratorium than a ban, because they don't expect that. If you look at the timeline of what they're happening, if this bill, once it gets royal assent, then there's 6 to 8 months for the Governor and Council to come up with regulations, and then there's another year or more to set up the regulator. So there won't even be, even if there was a ban, there's nothing to enforce it in that time, right? So a moratorium, because if they do all the things that are outlined in this bill in terms of safety for kids, they can ask for an exemption from the ban, and it would be granted or not by the regulator, which has to be set up still. So those things include a duty to protect children, so age-appropriate design.
Right.
It also could. In terms of harmful content, there's 7 main categories they've got to make sure kids don't have access to, or that is even on there, so that you and I cannot have access to it either. Content that sexually victimizes a child, content that induces a child to harm themselves, content used to bully a child, content that foments hatred, content that incites violence, terrorism, or violent extremism content, or intimate content communicated without consent.
Right.
So there's a bunch of hoops that they're going to have to go through. And when it comes to that age-appropriate design, that would include things like not making it addictive to children in terms of the algorithms. That could be incorporated in that. What's interesting, too, is what would the penalties be?
Right.
So they're saying that the penalty, if there's non-compliance on some of this, and not just the age ban, but the other things that are in it, would be 3% of global revenue, global value, or 10 million, whichever is greater. And there is capacity for repeated fines. So if they keep non-complying, I don't think we got a sense that the first thing would be a fine.
Right.
There'd be a non-compliance order. But it sounds like they wanted to do that quite seriously. There is, with the chatbots, duty to be transparent. There isn't a requirement to report to police, but they have to publish their safety plans to the regulator so that, I guess, they know what the threshold is.
Okay, just to press pause here for a second, and let's go through the social media timeline. So the legislation was tabled in the House less than an hour ago, about 12 minutes after 4 or whatever. We had the techno briefing. So the legislation has to go through the House. Then there's a 6 to 8 month period where the government, they estimate, will set up the regulations that they're empowered to on what the standards will be that social media companies have to meet. Once those regulations are in place, that is when the ban on social media, 16 and under, comes in. You have to stop everyone and deal with the verification process. The issue then becomes to get the exemption that if you move to the age-appropriate system design and the safety standards, you apply to the regulator. But the regulator, they estimate,
set up yet.
is 18 months away.
Yes.
So a ban could come into place 6 to 8 months from the passing of the legislation, but the ability to get exemptions could be a year or more after that. So it is possible we have a gap here where things are blocked with no ability to be remedied, or they delay it all, but it sounds like we are 18 months to 2 years away from this system to be up and running as designed.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
And the two things I would take away from that is, although there then is this gap in time where a ban could be in place, there's still no regulator to enforce that ban.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily a real ban, even though they can apply for an exemption.
Right. Well, I guess the ban would be implied by the legislation.
Yes.
And the penalties would be implied by the legislation. But yes,
And they did talk
there
about
are
it being
timeline
an
issues here.
incentive
Yeah.
for when the regulator is in place. Hey, we've had this ban, we can reverse it.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we'll hear maybe from Mark Miller on this, because the tech companies are going to move faster than government on this and try to get to a point where there is no dark period, where they lose access to this potential future adult customer base. And we'll have to see how they sequence this whole thing. So the AI chatbot is interesting. Why there is no duty to report to police except to publish your transparency issues, because I mean the Tumbler Ridge scenario, which is the live example here, you know, the concern was they dragged OpenAI in to say you need to flag this. So I'm curious to see how that comes in there. I mean, when you look at all of it and what we've heard to this point, you know, in the pre-detailed conversations we have with politicians and in the technical briefing today, I mean, what should Canadians take from this in terms of the direction they're going in here?
I think they're trying to find a balance, because there was a lot of talk about not wanting to repeat the mistakes of the previous online harm bills that didn't transpire because of, yes, it was a minority government, but they were problematic along the way. They want to get as many people on board. They want to show that they are taking these concerns seriously, but they also want to learn the lessons from, let's say, Australia, and that's why it's more of this moratorium with a possible exemption than a ban, because they're not really that successful in enforcing that ban in Australia. So they want to incentivize the social media companies to do the things they actually want. It's not so much that they don't want kids on social media, they don't want kids on social media as it stands right now. But it could be a safer place. It could be a less harmful place if the social media companies play ball.
Right, yes, there's still more than 70% of teenagers accessing social media accounts in Australia, though you need probably a bit more of a longitudinal study before you draw conclusions, because that could change as compliance and generations shift. Okay, Karina Roman, thank you so much. We're standing by waiting for Mark Miller to come out and take some questions and explain the way he sees this coming into force. It's one of those fly by the seat of your pants things, as we don't control the schedule of the show today. So we brought the Power panel in early. We've got Tim Powers. He's here with me. He has worked as a strategist for Conservative parties. And Jordan Likeness is here. She is a former NDP strategist. And we're soon hoping to be joined by Amanda Avero, a former Liberal Party communications strategist, who I think is being throttled by traffic rather than a government regulator. And we'll see where that goes. So Tim, you know, they've landed on a ban on social media with an exemptions framework, that if you move towards this age-appropriate design and structure and content framework, you can get back, you can start having the kids back online. All of it going to be overseen by a digital commission. What do you make of that high-level assessment here?
Well, let's go back even one step further. They're responding to the political pressure that parents and others are putting upon them about act. So they're acting, and on the surface, the actions seem sensible and predictable, but the practicality of the acting, as you've pointed out, as Karina's pointed out in the reporting, it's going to take a while before there's a regulator there who has the ability to come in and say, you screwed this up and you screwed that up. It's somewhat analogous, David, I think, to what governments and health authorities tried to do with tobacco companies. You know, embarrassment, moral suasion, got to product labeling eventually that said this is dangerous, and if you use it, it's Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to, we got a heads up. Mark Miller's coming in. Jordan, your quick 10 seconds just before he starts. Your high-level thought.
Yeah, I think the politics of this are very good. There's a lot of concern among Canadian parents about the fact that children have access in an unmitigated way to social media right now. We've been having conversations about how to get social media platforms to be more accountable for content, reaching well back to the Christchurch mosque shootings in 2019. And it's taken the better part of a decade. This is the third attempt now, again, just to regulate social media, let alone chatbots. So I think it's a complicated road ahead.
Okay, we're going to go now live to the National Press Theatre where Heritage and Culture and Identity Minister Mark Miller is getting ready to have his press conference. He's joined by Rachel Bendayan and Anna Gainey, I believe, is who I saw coming in with him. Let's turn it over to the minister.
In front of you, there's a sticker there to help protect the health and safety of our interpreters. I understand we have a number of speakers today. I would just like to issue a gentle reminder that we would like to keep our remarks to 15 minutes, and that way we can have as much time as possible for all of the questions. So with that, I will hand it over to the minister. Following the remarks, we'll go to any questions that we have in the room. If time allows, we'll be able to go to Zoom. So thank you, Minister.
Bonjour à tous. Je tiens d'abord à reconnaître que nous nous trouvons sur le
I'd like to start by
territoire.
recognizing that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I am Rachel Bendania from the riding of Outremont and Parliamentary Secretary. I want to talk about why today's issues are so important for the Prime Minister and why he particularly cares about the safety of our children.
Of safe social media for well over a year, both in a very public-facing way, but also behind the scenes. And throughout that time, I've had the opportunity to meet with parents, teachers, brain health researchers, youth advocates, and technology companies, organizations such as Unplugged Canada, Skills Before Screens, RAD, Phone Free Schools Movement, many others. We've also learned a lot as a government from other like-minded governments and experts abroad, including in jurisdictions that have already taken steps to address this very issue. What we've heard is that technology brings, of course, enormous opportunities, but that the status quo is untenable. As a mother, and I know there are many parents up here, this issue is deeply personal. Protecting children online is not a partisan issue, of course. It's a responsibility that we all share. And there's already a growing consensus in Canada that legislators, platforms, families all have a role to play. At its core, this is about the kind of world we want our kids to grow up in. Mieux protéger nos enfants, exiger davantage
Better protect our children,
de la part des grandes plateformes et bâtir
requiring
un
the
environnement numérique plus sûr
big tech to
pour
be
tous
more
les
platform
Canadiens,
and creating
sont des
to be more
priorités pour le
responsible
gouvernement.
and to creating a safer online space for Canadians is a priority for our government, and today we are taking a major step towards that, because at the end of the day it's not just about technology, it's about the world that we want to see our children grow in, a world where innovation serves people and where the safety of our children is not considered a cost for progress. It is possible to strike the right balance, but to get there we must act. And when the health of our children are at risk, inaction is not an option. And
it's my pleasure to introduce Dr.
I'm now
from Sick Kids.
like
Thank you so much. My name is Dr. Charlotte Moore Hepburn. I've been a practicing pediatrician for the last 20 years and have the pleasure of serving as the director of the Child Health Policy Accelerator at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. We all know that the lives of our children and young people have been profoundly reshaped by the introduction of digital platforms and services. These technologies influence every aspect of their lives, how they learn and play, how they socialize, and fundamentally understand the world around them. And while there are some benefits to these platforms, the rapid integration of social media and AI into their everyday life has outpaced the protections needed to keep them safe. Said another way, young people's engagement with the online world is the largest fully unregulated clinical trial affecting human development in the history of human civilization. Canadian parents and families want action and meaningful accountability. Today's announcement is an important response to their very serious concerns. In outpatient settings and emergency departments and inpatient units, pediatricians like me have been treating young people for anxiety, depression, self-harm, disordered eating at alarmingly increasing rates. These harms are not only driven by the content that children and youth encounter online, they are also linked to the very design of these digital platforms that captivate and profit from their attention. We must safeguard the very precious and uniquely vulnerable developmental window that is childhood and adolescence. Canada needs this comprehensive framework that establishes clear responsibilities for platforms to act safely and responsibly in both the building and operating of the products they provide. Now, history has proven that this requires strong government oversight, and an independent commission with the authority, expertise, and resources to monitor and enforce compliance is essential to ensuring that legislative protections are actually meaningful in practice. The health and development of an entire generation of young people depends on the decisions that we make about this now, today, and our seriousness of our commitment to getting this right moving forward. Thank you.
Je pense que c'est moi. Le micro, ouais. I'm sorry. Is it on? Yeah, good. Okay, sorry.
Hi, everyone.
Youth and Member of Parliament for NDG Westmount. Je suis contente d'être.
I'm happy to be here today.
Our government clearly has a mandate and a duty both to protect all Canadians and especially children. The digital world connects us, educates us, and drives our economy. But it has also become a space where too many children are increasingly exposed to harmful content, harmful behavior, and harmful images. We cannot postpone taking action to protect them. Au cours de cette année, j'ai rencontré des pédiatres, des enseignants.
Throughout the year, I met with pediatricians, researchers, parents, and young people themselves. They sent an urgent and clear message. Public safety authorities are united on the fact that social media is not safe enough for young people. And we need to act to reduce risks.
Exploited and targeted with no consistent safeguards or accountability. The harms are real, they are intensifying, and they are happening to children across this country. I'm also here as a parent of 3, and like so many moms and dads across this country, I have raised my kids in a digital world that moves sometimes faster than many of us parents feel we can actually keep up with. And I know very personally the stress and worry that underpins conversations about how to use your phone, which apps, screen time limits, boundaries, group chats, and all of these types of things. So I'm particularly proud to be here today and be part of a government delivering on this commitment to protect our kids online. Our laws were drafted in a pre-digital era. They focus more on punishment and place almost no obligation on platforms to prevent harm. And that changes today. Les plateformes en ligne doivent être plus sécuritaires.
Online platforms need to be safer for children. And without an action plan, social media maintains our young people in a toxic environment, and that's the goal.
Advocates and the organizations who have fought for this, some of whom are sitting up here with us today. You showed up and shared your stories. You walked into offices like mine and told us what was happening to kids. And I want you to know that we hear you. I'm proud to be here today alongside my colleague, Minister Miller. His leadership has been instrumental in getting us here today. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hi everyone. Thank you, Anne and Rachel, Dr. Hepburn. Il y a quelques semaines, justement, à ces kids à Toronto, un médecin me disait
At Sick Kids Toronto, a doctor told me that a young person was admitted to the ICU in a catatonic state. Catatonic. Because she was a victim of cyberbullying. Her so-called friends created a website simply to mock her. The result was the fact that she ended up in the hospital. One young person out of 4 aged between 12 to 17 has been victim of cyberbullying in this country. According to the Canadian Child Services, 52% of young people have received unsolicited sexual images online, and 44% have been solicited to send intimate pictures.
There were 19,000 incidents of online child sex exploitation in Canada, which is a 500% increase in a few short years. Reports also show that online luring of children is on the rise. As a result of all this, kids exposed to this have a 4 times higher incidence of ideation, and suicidal thoughts. And we've seen the tragic consequences of online harm both around the world and here in Canada, notably at Tumbler Ridge. And the numbers you're hearing, and you'll hear more from our colleagues, are bone-chilling. Behind every one of these stats is a child, a family, and a life. Au cours des derniers mois, j'ai rencontré des parents.
For the past few months, I met with parents, doctors, experts, and children. I've received the same question: how to better protect our children from online dangers. As a society, we must act. As parents, as doctors, as a government, we are all responsible for protecting our children. We have to be honest. We are behind. Canada is behind. Our laws are behind the digital era. We have tools to act when the harm was caused, but we need to do more to prevent them from being harmed.
Thanks to the recent changes to the criminal code, to prosecute the harm once it's occurred, to sue people, but the damage is done. This is unacceptable. We're failing our children. Enough is enough. Our parents cannot face these challenges alone, and the safety of children can't be an afterthought. We need basic protection in place so every child in this country can be safe on platforms they use every day. This is why we are introducing the Safe Social Media Act. The Act will establish a minimum age of 16 to have a social media account. The Act will require social media platforms and AI chatbot services to do more to protect children and make their platforms safe by design. Social media and AI chat platforms will have a responsibility to protect children from harmful content, including content that promotes self-harm, sexual exploitation, violence, hatred, bullying, or the non-consensual sharing of intimate images. Social media services will have to remove, within 24 hours, content that sexually victimizes a child or shares intimate content without consent, including sexually explicit deepfakes. And AI chatbot services will be required to mitigate the risk of chatbot communicating harmful content that have clear protocols in place when a user expresses an intention to harm themselves or others. They too will have to be safe by design. Platforms will have to be transparent and accountable to Canadians and submit publicly disclosed digital safety plans to the Digital Safety Commission. The measures in this bill represent, in my view, the basic expectation that parents and Canadians for keeping their kids safe online. I believe all parties should agree on the importance of these minimum safeguards. C'est la base d'une conversation nationale.
It's the foundation of a national conversation. This conversation that's already happening around the world. Because online harms do not care about borders. We need to work together beyond political parties to solve this critical issue. We owe it to our children. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. And we have other people who also speak to this, including from the CMA.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm speaking on behalf of Canada Physicians in support of the Safe Social Media Act. For too long, tech and social media companies have profited off the attention of our children without any guardrails. I'm speaking both as a physician who sees dozens of kids every single day in my practice and also as a father to 2 young girls. It's totally unacceptable that the profit comes at the expense of our children's mental health, safety, and overall well-being. Every day, doctors see online how harms can hurt their children and their families. Everything from self-image issues to cyberbullying and self-harm and exposure to sexualized and harmful content. Time is up. We've seen enough. Platforms must be designed with safety as a key priority. They must limit exposure to harmful content, and they must take responsibility for the enormous impact that they're having. The Canadian Medical Association supports this bill and urges all parties to move swiftly to protect young people. Thank you. Merci. Eshe Miigwech.
That's great. Good afternoon, everyone. I start by saying that this is absolutely a historic day for the protection of Canadian children. Our organization has been on the front lines every single day, and every single day we bear witness to the injury and the harm of not only what is happening to Canadian children in this country, but also childhood in general. Every single year, we receive approximately 30,000 reports that come into cybertip.ca, Canada's tip line. We take reports on 8 different crime types that occur against children. We have also seen, since 2020, a 300% increase in online luring of children. We have kids as young as 10, 11 years old coming into us in crisis. We have families that are unraveling, that don't know how to protect their children. And it's not because parents are failing, it's because they are outmatched. And so what we understand is we've had a deliberate manufacturing of online spaces that put profit over and above safety. And at the same time, we are putting children in spaces equally that we would expect adults to be within. Our organization also issues between 10 to 20,000 removal notices a day of child sexual abuse material around the internet. This is one organization receiving this volume, receiving these notices. I think we cannot even appreciate the scale. And finally, I'm going to close on something just to add to the excellent points of everybody here. When we talk about tech responsibility and letting them off the hook, this is not their priority. When back in 2013, on financial sextortion reports coming into our organization, we received 40. Fast forward 10 years later to 2023, 4,762. What I close with is that these are not numbers. We keep track of lives of children that have been lost in Canada and around the world, children who have taken their lives because they cannot compete with organized crime networks having access to our children in Canadian homes. So today we applaud the move that we're not going to let perfect get in the way of good. Canada has signaled, along with the other G7 and other countries around the world, that we have to catch up when we're looking at online crimes against citizens in Canada, and particularly against Canadian children. And today is a day that we've done it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. We'll now pass to our question and answer period. Reporters, please stick to one question and one follow-up so that we can get to as many people as possible. And I would ask the same to our speakers again, if you can keep your remarks as concise as possible so that we can get to as many reporters as we have in the room. So to start off, we'll go with Andréane Apablaza from Radio Canada.
Bonjour, la question est pour
Hi,
Monsieur Miller.
my question is for Mr. Miller. Why not ban AI chatbots for children under 16, especially after what happened at Tumbler Ridge?
Très bonne question.
Excellent question.
Cette loi
One,
comporte cette nouveauté de
this bill has something new,
que les robots
which is to make sure that chatbots
ou les chatbots, peu importe l'expression qu'on utilise, soient sécuritaires dès leur conception.
are safe by design.
C'est importante.
That's an important piece of progress that we would not have been able to do had we introduced that bill in other places. We all saw what happened at Tumbler Ridge.
Faut admettre quand même que les chatbots ne sont
You have
pas
to admit that chatbots
que les méfaits
are not as well studied as the harms created by online
pas
platforms.
nécessairement le même rôle social que
And they do not necessarily have the same social role as
les sociaux.
the social media platforms.
On sait très bien que ces plateformes, que
So
ces
we know
chatbots
very well that these chatbots themselves
dès leur conception,
can be safe by design.
soient sujets à un devoir de responsabilité, un devoir de protéger les enfants. Et
They can be subject to requirements to protect children, as well as requirements to remove
c'est important de
sexual
penser
content.
ce qui a trait au
That's an
moratoire
important step
tel.
forward.
On pense
As
que
for the
c'est
moratorium
pas
itself,
l'instant.
we didn't think that right now it is the right time for it. That's why we excluded it.
Et pouvez-vous expliquer comment les
Can you
exemptions
explain
vont fonctionner
how
pour
the
les
exemptions
réseaux
will
sociaux qui
work
respectent les
for social media platforms that respect the rules?
Il y a la mise en place d'une commission
First, there is the creation of a commission
dans 18 mois.
that should be ready to go in 18 months. It's an ambitious timeline. It will be done through phases, but platforms will need to talk to the commissioner and the commission to receive exemptions and to prove that their platforms are safe. I understand that there's a delay. I said it in my speech
Du rattrapage à faire
that
au Canada.
we need to catch up, that Canada is behind.
Que plusieurs plateformes ont opéré sans cette
But because many platforms operated with impunity for a long time,
pour gérer cette relation. Mais c'est une relation qui est très importante.
they can excuse us for taking some time for creating this. This is the implementation of a very important bill to protect children from
Thank you.
harms.
We'll go to Laura Osmond from The Logic. Hey there, thanks for taking our questions. If I'm reading correctly, the maximum fine for a violation is something like 3% of the company's global revenues. How would the regulator be able to recover fines of that size, which could be very, very substantial?
You know, it'll depend on the severity of the infraction and the compliance or non-compliance that occurs, Laura, as you mentioned. But there, and I suspect you're referring to platforms that wouldn't have assets in Canada that could be immediately seized, but there are plenty of relationships that we have, legal relationships that we have with other countries to enforce jurisdiction and judgments. So obviously, there will probably be a legal process, but they are significant fines because, as you mentioned, some of these companies have very significant turnover. But that's the seriousness of the law.
Given the size of the maximum fine and the reaction from Washington to previous attempts to regulate internet companies that operate in Canada but are based in the U.S., was that a consideration at all in terms of drafting this bill and the kind of fines or kind of punishments you can impose on these platforms?
The most important consideration was to protect kids, Laura, first and foremost, Canadian kids. The reality is we have discussed with a lot of these platforms what this law would look like. The reactions, to be quite frank, have been anywhere ranging from, frankly, cautiously optimistic to neutral. Wait and see, obviously, until they inspect the content of the legislation, just like MPs are doing currently. I'd say there's a distinction between large platforms feeling they are being taxed or feeling that revenues are going to third parties that they don't control, perhaps distributing money to competitors, and making sure there's a standard for protecting kids. I'm not going to presume that the administration in the U.S. doesn't want to protect kids. And in fact, we see many acts in Congress that are starting to mirror in a piecemeal fashion some of the most important parts of this bill, which is first and foremost to remove material, but also to prevent the harms from happening in the first place. Thanks.
Thank you. Marie Vastel from Le Devoir.
I think I will continue on that. You said that you spoke with some of the platforms. Did you receive indication that shows whether they're against collaboration? I know that in some cases they may be indifferent, but maybe in some cases they may be reluctant to change how they do things, to change their algorithms, as they want to prioritize profit, and therefore they want to create this addictive product. Did you talk to them? Do you feel that things will work?
Ben, je pense qu'ils doivent, oui.
Yes.
C'est beau d'imposer des amendes.
Imposing penalties is one thing,
D'abord et avant tout, on veut que les gens
but first and foremost, we want to make sure that people follow the law.
d'une commission, d'un dialogue.
That's why you need a commission. That's,
D'accord, mais il faut s'écouter.
the government needs to listen.
Je pense qu'avec le nombre de litiges
The number of litigations,
qui sont, il y en a au Canada, mais surtout
in Canada, but especially in the United States,
il y a des preuves très probantes.
there is clear evidence
Les gens deviennent accros. Et
that
c'était
people become addicted.
quelque chose que les plateformes visaient d'abord.
That's something that platforms sought. They wanted people to be
sans
addicted.
cause.
They understood what they were doing.
Donc, ils attendent à voir un. Il y a comme un va-et-vient.
So there seems to be this back and forth with these
Ils
platforms
disent qu'ils ne sont pas contre un standard
because they're saying that they're not against any
de
standards,
l'input sur
but they want input on its implementation.
pour avoir un dialogue.
That's why you need this commission to keep this continuous dialogue.
Des amendes qui sont significatives.
In the worst
Étant donné
cases, there may be significant
qu'on voit aux
penalties.
États-Unis avec les litiges
But what we see with the USA,
très importantes,
there is litigation with serious consequences,
pas surpris qu'on va imposer un standard.
and therefore they are not surprised that we're imposing the standard that seeks to reduce harm to children. They are not surprised, but will they accept it? So my follow-up question,
Prenez le temps que vous voulez, puis je sais que vous avez droit à juste 2 questions.
take your time. I know you're just allowed
La
a
réalité,
few
c'est qu'ils
questions.
s'attendent à quelque chose.
The reality is that they expect something,
Le contenu de la loi qui
but they also expect to be able to see the content of the bill.
bien inspecter la loi. Puis,
When you table a bill, people need to be able to look at that bill and provide
la réaction
input.
que j'ai vue, c'était
But the reactions that I've seen
une réaction qui était soit neutre ou soit positive.
is either neutral or positive.
Pour ma follow-up,
My follow-up
juste
question.
préciser 2 petits trucs qui n'étaient pas
I would
tout à fait clairs dans le briefing.
like to have
Je
two
comprends que ça va être par
details that
réglementation,
were
mais
not
avez-vous une idée pour
precise
les
in
gens
the
à la
briefing.
maison, les parents,
It's about
que
regulations.
ça va être les critères pour pouvoir
Can you explain to people who are watching what are the criteria for any exemptions for those platforms when it comes to banning the use for children under 16, as well as when it will come into force? In the briefing, they said that we need to wait after regulations. That can take many months, and the commission may start operating after 18 months. So there seems to be this many months where there is a ban but no commission. Can you explain that?
Complètement prête
Well,
pour respecter la loi.
it's not because there's no commission that you don't have to follow the law. The law comes into force, and then platforms will have to follow the law.
Avoir une réglementation.
The of the commission is that they can create regulations and establish criteria that exempts platforms because they can show that they're safe by design.
Des critères plus précis que dans le libellé de la loi.
That will be more precise criteria than the wording of the act.
Précision. Mais c'est sûr que ça va
But
prendre
of course, that takes time.
de grâce, étant donné l'état actuel des choses.
That's a good thing because when you look at what's happening right now, people will have to wait for a few months.
Minister Miller, can you clarify in regards to what you've just said in terms of the timing, how this bill works? There's the possibility that no companies will be banned. Given that you have not passed the bill, it would take, is it 18 months from royal assent before a regulator is created? Is it as soon as the bill gets royal assent, does the social media ban come in place? I think that's what my colleague was referring to. Will a social media ban take place before a regulator sets the exemptions? Or are you giving the regulator 18 months so that companies, these big tech companies, can actually catch up? So you're actually giving them the opportunity, I guess, as you say, to be safe by design as opposed to imposing a ban.
They have to, Judy, take the appropriate measures to limit kids under 16 from opening social media accounts as soon as the law comes into force. That's clear. And you can see that in the law. The exemptions is a process whereby they would have to demonstrate that they are safe by design, and that will be the process of compliance that they will enter into with the Commission as it gets phased up. Is that on month 18? I would think that as the Commission establishes its priorities, that would be one of the first ones, ensuring proper compliance with the law in the case of egregious breaches of it.
So as soon as this bill gets royal assent, this social media ban for kids under 16 comes in place, and all big tech companies, social media companies, will have to have that age verification in place.
Yep.
Okay.
And then, sorry,
That's
and then
not
I
a
just
second
want to
We're gonna have to
clarify.
speed this up, but-
Okay,
Give her another question because I just answered it twice. So.
okay. And given the state of negotiations with the U.S., how can Canadians be confident that this bill will be prioritized, that your government will pass this bill quickly? I'm thinking of the Online Streaming Act. I'm thinking about the Digital Services Act that was pulled. How can we be confident that under U.S. pressure that this government won't fold?
There's no law that's been pulled, to be clear, but this is a law about protecting kids, and the priority is to protect kids in Canada. I think if you want to, that's not something you trade for. If you look at legislators on both sides of the political spectrum in Canada and in the U.S., I think everyone's on the same page as that.
All right, thank you. Mylène Crête, La Presse.
Bonjour, ma question est pour vous,
Hello.
Monsieur Miller.
My question is for you, Mr. Miller. Do you have examples of safety measures that may be considered sufficient for social media companies so that they will not have to restrict social media for people under 16? I want concrete examples. I understand the importance of examples, but we can talk about specific cases until the end of times. I am not the commissioner who will be making those decisions. There are many criteria in the bill that can give you indicators as to the kind of criteria that will be developed to protect children. 7 types of harm are explicitly covered by the bill. I would expect that the platforms will have to show that they can show that they will ensure that there is reduced exposure of these 7 types of harm. For example, say a young person goes to a social media platform and there's a box that just says, "Are you under 16?" and then you answer yes or no. Is that it? You're talking about the age verification process, which uses a probabilistic system. Platforms will need to ensure that private information is protected. But when it comes to young people being able to overcome those restrictions, platforms still need to show us how they are safe by design. For example, you can compare the experience of a young person in Australia. It's not perfect there, but they are ahead of us. Young Australians have a much better experience than young Canadians. Perfection is impossible, but we can do better.
Okay. Mickey Jurek, Politico.
Thank you so much. I'm just kind of going to zoom out a little, maybe talk about this from a global perspective. France is pushing for a statement on online harms at the G7, which Canada is obviously helping with. But what does this bill signal to allies ahead of next week's G7 meeting, especially as major tech companies and CEOs will be sitting down with Western leaders, including the Prime Minister?
I mean, this is first and foremost, Mickey, about protecting Canadian kids. We need international leadership. I think humbly we are catching up. So that's an important step. The jurisdictions you're talking about, I met my colleague Laura Miller in France, who was championing President Macron's law in France through through the legislative process. They're talking about a ban, but they also have the EU process that has been years ahead of us. So they are not doing the two things that we are doing and the catching up that we are doing. So I think it's very important for the Prime Minister to show leadership on the world stage and to support the efforts that have taken place internationally. But this is a law that stands on its own to support Canadians. And whatever may be internationally is important, but it is important that we do stand together to make sure that platforms are observing the basic elements of responsibility, protecting kids, acting responsibly, and taking down really offensive material within a reasonable period of time, and in the case of our law, 24 hours.
Thank you. And then as a follow-up, the Trump administration has repeatedly warned against foreign countries seeking to regulate U.S. tech companies. They argue that the U.S. should maintain responsibility for governing its sector. How worried are you about retaliation from the Trump administration?
I worry more about kids.
So you're not worried about
I worry
retaliation?
about kids. I worry about making sure kids are safe in this country, Mickey.
Okay. Thank you. We'll go to Dylan Robertson from Canadian Press.
Hi, thanks for taking our questions. Minister Miller, why not ban access to chatbots for kids under 16?
I mentioned that to your colleague in French. Chatbots are different than classical social media. It is very much an evolving playing field, admittedly. They play a function and a role that can be very damaging towards kids, but can also play an important function in the educational system and in the AI strategy that we are putting forward. I would say that whereas social media platforms classically have been studied for more than a decades, less studied in the case of the evolution of chatbots. We're going to have to keep a close eye on it, but it did not feel appropriate to impose a minimum age restriction at this time. However, and this is the important part of this bill and the catching up that we do, we will impose the same responsibilities to protect kids first and foremost, be safe by design, act responsibly in the case of sexual materials, particularly of children, to be removed within a 24-hour period. Those duties stay, and I think that's a reason. It's a very basic thing to expect from a chatbot service, particularly in the wake of Tumbler Ridge.
And how will you make sure that the mechanisms that the companies are using to verify age don't violate privacy or put private information at risk?
So this is something that we were very conscious of when drafting the law. In the area of the age restriction in particular, it is a question of sometimes, yes, perfection being the enemy of the good, because there are trade-offs, particularly with respect to people's privacy, that you have if you have strict enforcement to the level of a country that Canada isn't. We put an explicit exclusion on private messaging, which is key to this law. Now, I won't say that some bullying doesn't occur as part of private messaging, but we won't be asking platforms or chatbot services to break encryption or to potentially violate Section 184 of the Criminal Code. To be honest, it's a trade-off. There are reasonable restrictions on rights in this country, but in this case, we felt the line was drawn and reasonable in this context to make sure private messaging, for example, was excluded from the ambit of the law. There are also updates to the privacy laws that are coming in the context of the of AI and a piece of legislation that hasn't been updated in decades. So that will also be will dovetail into this particular piece of legislation.
Thanks. Stephanie Taylor from National Post.
Hi, Minister. I just want to clarify, if you're saying that this ban is going to take effect once this bill receives royal assent, at what stage is your government going to be deciding which social media platforms will be covered by this ban? And do you have any idea today that you'd be willing to share with Canadians as to which social media platforms are going to be covered by this ban?
Look, certainly, yes, we do. Certainly, Meta, Facebook's, Snapchat, anything that has that. So there's a definition of what social media is in the law, and that it's pretty clear which services would be included. You know, there'll be some borderline decisions at one point. There was a discussion on in and on gaming, but that's quite clear in our mind what that is.
Okay, and just to clarify as well, why decide to include, I guess, porn sites in this as well? And do you have any examples of the sites that this is going to be applying to? Or is the government going to have to set a definition of like what counts as a site that has enough porn on it that people shouldn't be on it or kids shouldn't be on it?
Do you want me to talk to you about my experience with porn sites? I'm not going to, I don't think I'll fall into that trap necessarily, but I think that it isn't, you know, this isn't about, first and foremost, regulating the internet. There are certain sites that are pornographic where user content can be uploaded publicly, and it would be those that would be covered by the ambit of it. It isn't all porn sites, but principally the ones that fall into the category of social media, where users can interact and upload conduct that is then deemed offensive under the 7 broad categories that I enumerated or are enumerated inside the Act.
Thank you. David Thurton from CBC.
Hi, folks. Australia has done something similar, banning kids under 16, but young people have found a way to circumvent that. What makes you think the same won't happen here in Canada?
It's an important question because it speaks to the efficacy and the efficiency of the law and our capacity to implement it and put it into force, David. At the same time, let's have some context here. We wouldn't have courts if laws were perfect and everyone observed them. That is the reality. The importance of a regulatory body is one that can create a compliance mechanism where we can work with industry and platforms to make sure that they are reducing the harm and the most egregious content that kids are being exposed to, and impose penalties in that case. You know, the efficacy of a law depends obviously on its compliance, but we've got plenty of laws out there, unfortunately, that people don't comply with. That is why it was so key to have a commission able to interact with industry and able to give some teeth to this law so that we just didn't hope and pray that this would be enforced. And that's, I think, the reality we all have to face as we ramp up a commission within a very short 18-month time frame.
And the Tumbler Ridge shooter's communication with ChatGPT wasn't reported to police. Why didn't you order AI chatbots in this bill to report that kind of activity to the police?
We had a long policy discussion about what should be in and out of this bill. The preference was to insert a very onerous regime that would impose mandatory transparency to the public about how many incidents platforms are seeing, what their compliance mechanism is, what their reporting out requirement is. Imposing this duty to inform authorities is a different step, I believe, and not in my mind necessarily one, well, that isn't being done because OpenAI did have a protocol for reporting out. It just made an egregious human error. And so I'm not going to sit here and pretend today that there is one rapid solution that would have prevented what happened at Tumbler Ridge from happening. But I do think this law could have made a difference. And what that difference is something that is for others to decide. Going forward, it will certainly reduce the exposure of people to online harms, of kids in particular, but also make an onerous requirement on chatbots to interact in a way that is safe and safe by design, and to have compliance mechanisms within those chatbot services that certainly are well capitalized to tell us how they're reporting, who they're reporting to, and what they're reporting to, and essentially create an obligation to have a regime that is robust and that interacts with police and forces around the world in a responsible way.
Mari Wolf, Globe and Mail.
Thanks for taking our questions. I wondered if you could give us some insights into what kind of changes you would expect social media platforms to make in order to be exempt from a social media ban. For example, many parents have expressed concerns about the addictive qualities of social media, for example, infinite scroll, autoplay, these kind of features. Are you planning to issue a policy directions to give some pointers to the new regulator?
Well, first and foremost, I would expect them to stop exposing kids to all that crap that we see. There are a number of criteria that are in the law that people can tease out, as I mentioned to your colleague in French, as to what that expectation would be. There will be a requirement to submit their safety plans according to the law, to work with the commissioner to make sure that their sites, if they want them exempted for kids under 16, to be, again, safe by design, including in the architecture of their platforms that may include a number of the criteria and more that you're naming, Mary. But I'm not going to presuppose the outcome of that discussion, which is an important one. But there are some very broad criteria in the law right now that could give you an idea of where that would go.
Ms. Pendine, on Wednesday you said that the new bill would avoid many of the mistakes that other countries have made, and I presume you were talking about Australia, where apparently about 60% of under 16s have managed to remain on social media, possibly by migrating to smaller platforms like Roblox. When you're designating the number of type of social media platforms that are going to be covered by this, are you taking that into account, Mr. Miller, if you want to comment as well, so that sites such as Roblox are covered?
Thank you for the question, Marie. I think there were issues around privacy that Australia experienced and that a number of young Canadians in particular brought to light over the course of the last several months. That was taken extremely seriously by the minister and by the government when drafting the legislation, so I would point to that. You talk about certain statistics. I know that a lot of folks talk about 70% of kids in Australia are getting around the ban. When I've spoken to people in Australia, legislators and others, they have said that there's a 2-year study that they're undertaking, and that really it would only be after that study that we would have definitive statistics. So I do think that we need to look carefully at some of the numbers being thrown around. And I also think, as the minister very eloquently said a few minutes ago, that there will be folks that will try and get around laws and regulations. I don't think everybody wears their seatbelt. Doesn't mean that a law requiring the use of a seatbelt isn't useful or important. And I think there are also changes at a societal level that we are encouraging through this piece of legislation. There are, soccer coaches that organize their matches on social media platforms, making some kids who don't want to be on social media feel obliged to join in order to participate in social events. So I think that there are a number of objectives that this legislation has and that will be accomplished.
And Maria Collins from The Wire Report.
Hi, thanks for taking our questions. Canadians have waited over 5 years for this bill. What do you say to parents who look at this and say, okay, great, we have a law in the books, but we're 2 years away almost from having any way to actually enforce it?
I'll say a couple things. I haven't heard a parent say that the way you described it. And not that that isn't a concern, because it was a very important discussion that I had directly with the Prime Minister about the timeline of getting the Commission up and going. The law applies as soon as it comes into force. But there are some mechanisms that I discussed that need to be set up as part of the Commission within a tight timeline, which is an 18-month period. That is key to making sure that it is effective. You made a point about what's gone on in the last 5 years, and there's plenty of blame to go around. I would say a number of things. That Parliament hasn't, as you mentioned, hasn't been working particularly well prior to the arrival of this new government. There were previous iterations of the law that I would submit were an overreach and tried to do too much. I don't disagree with the sentiment of protecting kids, but there were, in my mind, legitimate criticisms about inserting criminal repercussions, having a separate human rights regime all into one bill that attracted some legitimate criticism from people that would normally support this type of bill. It is important to really solve what you're trying to fix as opposed to trying to do everything at once. I think that's an important takeaway of this. We are catching up for 5 to 10 years of delay, and that is unfortunate, but we're acting now. And I think that is the important takeaway. I'd say also the atmosphere has changed and the technological environment has changed. Had we passed the bill a year ago, we probably wouldn't be having a discussion on the responsibility of AI chatbots and probably only on online harms. We might probably be talking about extreme forms of hate and bullying more than we are today about equally, if not more significant concern of making sure kids are safe in the wake of Tumbler Ridge. I came in as a minister and quite frankly, I wanted a fresh look at this. So this represents that fresh look and the feedback from people around this table, but also caucus and most importantly, parents.
Okay, that is Minister Mark Miller answering questions and outlining some of the measures in their new digital safety legislation. They've been speaking now for about 45 minutes, close to an hour. We expect the minister to make his way to our studios here in just a little bit to take some more questions that we still have about how this is going to work. But the broad strokes are essentially that the legislation that has been proposed, once it is put in place, will create an immediate ban on social media companies from offering new accounts to anybody under the age of 16. And then over a period of time, regulations will be set that if social media companies meet these standards on safe by design and child focused by design, they can then apply to a yet to be created regulator for an exemption to allow them to reissue accounts to people under the age of 16. There is also an attempt to deal with the challenges presented by AI chatbots with a duty to be responsible and duty to protect children, though it is not as sweeping enforcement as it is with social media because of the evolving nature of that technology and the less social role it plays, according to what Mark Miller had to say. By his own admission, the government is catching up after 5 to 10 years of delay to where other countries are dealing with this. The Power Panel's been listening in. Amanda Alvaro has made it here. She joins us. Former Liberal communication strategist Tim Powers and Jordan Leichnitz are also here. Jordan, start with you. We've had a little bit more of an explanation of the thought process behind the framework and the design of this long-awaited and long-delayed legislation. What are your thoughts on what we heard from the Minister Miller there?
Well, I think it's clear that we're at the beginning of what is going to be a lengthy process here. And there's a lot of details in this legislation that are going to be filled in down the road through regulation and by the regulator when that person is eventually appointed. So it means that this is not something that's going to be really necessarily impactful immediately. I would say, though, I was encouraged to see that the government is taking seriously some of the design elements of social media platforms. So things like notification, this could include the endless scroll, autoplay of videos. Those are some of the structural things in social media that we know make it more addictive for kids, for adults, for everybody. And so addressing those is going to be really important. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions. You heard some of them during the press conference about what types of services are going to be included and not included. So things like Roblox, gaming platforms. We know that hundreds of thousands of young people in Canada are active on those platforms, and that also those can be an important site for radicalization, for hate. Yeah. And so there is probably a necessity for the legislation to look at how to get into those spaces, places like Discord as well. So I think that one of the things also that I would be looking to see from the government on this that we didn't hear as much about today is what are the educational components that are also going to go along with this? Because we know if we look at the Australian case where 7 in 10 young people are still on social media, it's still early days, but you're still seeing a lot of young people on social media. There also needs to be efforts to go along with this to equip young people for safety online, as well as holding these platforms really to account for the content that they have on there and the structure of their products. And so that is a tall order, but it's good to see the government making efforts in that direction.
Yeah, there are attempts to regulate content, two categories that must even be taken out within 24 hours having to do with sexualized images, non-consensual sexualized images or images of minors, which is a no-brainer. There are 7 other categories of harm, Amanda, they talk about here. It is unclear to me on whether these need to be monitored, reduced, or removed. Just now, I don't know the answer to that just yet, and it feels like it could be a while as they move through the debate, committee, regulations phase, and then creating the regulator phase, and then the implementation of it all before we actually really know how this is going to work.
Yeah, but I think, one of the members on the panel said we're not going to get in the way of perfect. And I think that's the right attitude. As a mom of a 12-year-old son, I am in the sweet spot of this, surrounded by other exasperated parents who feel like, we're fighting against these big tech companies who have built these platforms, like they said, to not just capture attention, but to be addictive, to create compulsive behavior and user scrolling. And, we have a hard time resisting it as adults. So to expect 12 and 13-year-olds to be able to resist it is completely unrealistic. I thought there were so many things said in that presser that made so much sense to me and felt like relief. They talked about the idea of seatbelt because they said, and I think this is one of the arguments that has been raised about, not everybody is hurt on social media. We didn't create seatbelts because everybody, every car crash was fatal. Governments need to regulate areas where there's a significant risk to kids, even if all kids aren't harmed. And as far as I know, mine haven't been, but we know the risk is real. We know it's there. So I think that there was a lot said today that should make parents feel hopeful, should make parents feel optimistic that the government is on their side. There was a conservative MP who said that parents just need to do better parenting. I mean, this is an insult to millions of parents who have been contending with this. The onus needs to be on these billion-dollar tech companies. If they're going to fight for our children's attention, they better be able to prove that what they're putting in front of them is safe, or they should be prevented from targeting them, and that's what the government's doing.
Well, yeah, Tim, when I say we're not going to know the answers, because we just don't know how the regulator is going to be structured, how large it's going to be there, right? But we see the direction, the signals of what they're trying to do here. And we heard that warning from Dr. Charlotte Moore Hepburn right off the top where she said, social media, this jumped out at me. It is the largest fully unregulated clinical trial affecting human development in the history of human civilization. That's quite a thing to say.
Yeah, that kind of whacks you in the face if you didn't already know how anxiety-driven it can be for a parent picking up on Amanda's theme when you have a child in this age range, particularly a male, who has access to different social media platforms and the like. I would say a few things. The government is obviously leading, and it's important, with symbolism. Dr. Hepburn, the head of the Canadian Medical Association, other leaders there. This wasn't a political announcement, though there's politics, of course, involved in it. There always is. But here are our experts. You're going to hear from every one of them. They are coming at you hard and fast, which leads me to the next point. I think what they're also hoping to do, David, because as we've all talked about so far, a lot of this legislative propositions are going to take some time here. Yeah. They want cascading effects. They want provinces now, and there are already provinces out there who are talking about banning social media to turn this into what they did with smoking. No, you can't go in that corner and smoke a cigarette because it's bad for your health. So in terms of a province, no, we don't want this in schools. We don't want that here. It's the cascade effect that had impact when it came to the anti-smoking campaign. Though as a parent, I will say this, I agree with Amanda, I can have some ray of hope, but I still feel today I'm no farther ahead than yesterday, though I see a path to tomorrow. It's the between now and then and what happens at what pace that I think will still be a legitimate concern to all of us. And I don't know how there would be any other way to deal with that. You and I were joking with Jordan here. I mean, the Westminster system is not built to deal with the digital age.
No.
And people are probably saying, why isn't there a regulator there now? Well, that regulator has nothing to regulate yet. Doesn't have enforcement tools, has no bills, and we wish we could snap our fingers. That's the unfortunate reality. So I go back as a parent, we have to live through the next little while, continue to parent as best we can, and hope more people in more places start to go hard at this in a responsible way.
You know, Jordan, I was struck by the blunt and candid admission from Mark Miller that we are catching up. We lost a lot of years. He didn't dwell on it too much. He said, look, Parliament hasn't worked, but he also talked about the overreach in their previous legislation, right? They were trying to do too much in too many areas, and it became a problem. This is more focused on young people politically from a comms perspective, and I'm not just trying to reduce it to that. It is an easier sell to a skeptical Parliament and a skeptical public, but it is the fact remains they are catching up. You know, we're all talking about our kids. My 9 and 12-year-old kids do not have social media accounts that I know of. I'm going to assume that they don't. But now they won't be able to get them until they're 16 now. I don't have to worry about that as a parent unless Facebook or whatever cleans up some of this stuff and gets the exemption, and then you can do it with more comfort.
Yeah, I think a big part of this, just to build on what Tim was saying, this is also about creating space for social change in Canada. And, you know, Premier Canoe has talked about this. Where now, you know, one of the things, you know, and I'm a parent as well, and my kids are really young for this, but I can foresee the day when they ask for these accounts. It's a lot easier for me to say, sorry, I can't, it's illegal. Then it's much less of a debate. It does take a little, it does help parents in that sense. It provides a little bit of weight to those decisions that before those were family decisions, and you had to kind of contend with the fact that different families would have different rules about those things. I do think that this is something where there's going to be some big questions in the details. We are going to get into discussions about the balance of free speech and regulation. We're going to get into discussions also about data gathering. Age verification on the part of these platforms will give these platforms access to huge amounts of data about Canadians. So what is going to be done to circumscribe that? That's going to be a really important
Just a bit of information on that, because I listened in on as much of the technical briefing as I could before, the show started. It's age estimation is what they're using. So it's not. It's like more of the AI thing where they look at your image, when you created the account, and your activity, and do an age estimation. That's what it sounds like right now. Not necessarily uploading an ID, but what they say, and this needs to be worked out. It needs to be efficient, collect a minimum amount of data, which must be protected, and then the data must also be destroyed when the process is dealt with. So. Sounds good. The implementation and function is going to be the question.
We'll see. And I think one of the things we also saw Minister Miller talking about, as particularly as he was discussing the chatbots and thresholds for reporting, there is also going to be debate here about how much of this is having these tech companies reporting more transparently about their practices, but not necessarily requiring them to do different things. So that's also a piece that's going to be debated within the legislation. And then the last thing I think that the government will need to contend with is the very real chance that this could become a pressure point in the trade negotiations with the United States. President Trump is surrounded by the owners of these tech platforms who have a lot of sway with him. And we know that in the past, their views have certainly made their way into trade discussions. So it's going to be very important for the government to stand strong on this and to not try to weaken or concede on this as part of any sort of a trade negotiation.
Yeah, I mean, Amanda, it's a little bit different than the past attempts to regulate the U.S. tech giants, because that came with a financial cost. If you got to pay for this, you're going to have to pay this taxation. With everything happening in the United States, pushback on you can't have deep fake sexualized images and non-consensual images of like kids online. That's a hard one to push back against, right? But the lower level of regulatory burden on the AI chatbots, I wonder what you thought of that, because you know, Mark Miller made the point. It's not as core in that social role as classic social media. It's still evolving. I mean, what do you make of that lower standard on that one?
Yeah, I thought his response was as transparent as it could be, which was basically like, we don't know enough yet. And hopefully, with the establishment of a commission, to have a regulator in place, you can start to look at and study some of these peripheral, which will become less peripheral and more mainstream. In the same vein or under the same umbrella. And I think that that's what he was alluding to. They're still playing catch up. We're still playing catch up on social media sites. Lots of questions. I think Jordan raised them about gaming sites. And then, of course, AI. How does that fit into the government's overall AI strategy? How does it fit into the fact that educators are introducing AI into their classroom? So I think that it requires another level of consideration. I thought he handled that question well. It's certainly, it's as big or such a growing concern for parents as well, right?
Yeah.
And so I do think that there will be added pressure, but as something like this comes to fruition, you can imagine that it gives the government or the regulator more license to be able to contend with some of these other factors like AI chatbots.
So, Tim, we've seen one statement from Google. The Google spokesperson says they are committed to working with Canada's federal government to establish higher safety standards for all platforms, which is an obvious day one statement, right? We'll see where things go from the tech companies when the rubber meets the road on the actual compliance costs and requirements and what limitations it places on them. But big tech is in an interesting moment now too, right? Like, yes, having the protection of the American government has helped them, but they are lashed to the mast of the USS Donald Trump right now as well, as reputationally. And the skepticism on AI and social media, this is happening across Western democracies at different pace. There is going to be a business case for them to start complying with a lot of this.
Well, at the end of the day, they're tech companies, but they're also companies that are driven by brand. And if the brand gets damaged or customers are saying, hey, you know what, I'm going to go somewhere else, they'll respond. The technology and the opportunity of technology, I think, has been so overwhelming and people have embraced it positively. Now we're at a stage in our history where we're seeing some of the negative effects, and some of them are pretty demonstrably horrible, particularly when they come to children. So there is a pushback. Again, it is very analogous, I think, though the speed is different, to tobacco. You go back and you look at tobacco. Originally, tobacco was a glamorous product. Tobacco was seen as a liberating product. And that all changed. Now, I don't know if big tech will meet the same fate as tobacco, though tobacco still has significant footprint around the world. But that was a corrective action that pushed back all the weight and wealth of big tobacco over the decades.
Yes, and some tobacco companies are probably still doing research on the links between their product and cancer, because, it's not scientifically proven if you're still doing a study on it. Okay, we are going to let you go. You've all been very flexible and patient coming here. Amanda Alvaro, thank you so much for battling traffic to get here. Tim Powers, Jordan Leibniz. We're going to release the power panel, but joining us now to help us digest all of this is Taylor Owen, who is the founding director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy and an associate professor of public policy at McGill University. Taylor Owen, this is getting to be a regular thing. It seems like it was only a week ago we were talking about AI. Now we're back with this one.
It just keeps on coming.
Well, what do you make of the direction the government is taking here and the balance of measures they put on the table?
I mean, in many ways, this is an iteration of the last Online Harms Act. It takes the core of that bill, the key provisions of it, like standing up an independent regulator, having duties to protect kids and duties to act responsibly, that put the onus on the companies that are making these technologies and these products to ensure that they're safe before they enter the Canadian market, and to make certain kinds of content completely inaccessible, as you mentioned, non-consensual intimate images and child sexual abuse material. So it takes that core, which I think was the right core, honestly. I mean, I think that's built on what a number of other countries have done. It's taken those lessons and builds on that effectively. But it's added two sort of somewhat more controversial elements. One is a restriction on access to users under 16 as a condition of gaining access to that market, of putting in place a bunch of safety measures before they get access to that market. And it includes chatbots, which is new.
But the components of the measures they're putting in place, I'm looking at some of the reaction. You are far more versed in this space than I am, quite obviously. I see people like Michael Geis, who you would know well. He's a critic of this, saying the amount of uncertainty and to be determined aspects of this bill are astonishing. So much left to cabinet, future Digital Safety Commission. Teenagers today concerned about losing access to social media don't have to worry too much about this will take years to implement. Now, that's on the exemption side. The ban's going to come in right away at royal assent, is what Mark Miller had to say. Then we'll figure out regulations and the regulator. Does this get to a more reasonable balance on how to deal with these companies in terms of focusing on the design and the content rather than sort of banning and fining sort of thing?
I mean, so it's not an outright ban. An outright ban doesn't ultimately work because it assumes that the products can never be made safe. And the very principle of this bill and of this regulatory or age-appropriate design approach is that actually regulations can incentivize companies to design safer products.
Right.
And I actually think that's the right approach. The question is how you make them do that.
Yes.
And it could be, and this is going to be one of the first trials in the world of this, of using a restriction of access as an incentive towards compliance. And I think that's probably the best way of thinking about this, that the restricting access to begin with is a tool to incentivize the companies to comply with the age-appropriate design code and the other criteria.
Yeah.
And it's going to be an experiment in that. Now, whether we're leaving too much for the commissioner is a really interesting question because that's always a debate in legislation, as you would know far better than I would, about how much do you lock into legislation and how much needs to be left nimble enough to be left to a regulator. And I actually think something like an age-appropriate design code, for example, these are the features that a company would have to include in their products if the products are likely to be used by kids. And other countries have these, and these might include things like no infinite scroll, or no targeted advertising, or no allowing a non-friend adult to contact a child, right? So design features of the product. You would never want to spell those out in legislation because those are always going to be changing. So you need to leave some things, certainly, to the commission to decide. Now, whether we've left too much to that or something, to the commissioner is going to be something we debate, certainly.
Well, yeah, that's going to be the challenge because, the tech companies move with the mantra of move fast and break things. Governments sometimes move slow and still break things, which has maybe been the experience of some of this. But you need to be able to respond to this because putting in these restrictions will lead to adaptations of behavior and technology in ways we can't necessarily anticipate right now. And if it requires a whole new legislative process, you're going to be constantly playing catch up. And the minister's already conceded they're 5 to 10 years behind on this one. So, but how do you actively enforce that? Like, if I'm going to use Facebook just because it's, I'm not saying they're going to not comply, but, if Facebook doesn't, stop.
I mean, there is a history of that.
Well, yes, you could post this clip maybe on their platform, but, if they don't comply with the under 16 ban and they keep issuing accounts to people under the age of 16, in the absence of the regulator being in place, like, what do you do? Do they just stop? Do they get geo-blocked from being accessible in Canada? Do you have to do that kind of a thing? How do you make a chat bot stop being accessible to Canadian kids if it decides I'm just going to be an American chatbot and not comply with your laws? Like, how do you firewall that in the day and age of VPNs and all the other technology out there?
Yeah, I mean, we regulate all sorts of companies that are based outside of Canada, that are global companies. So this isn't sort of unique to social media. However, these are global in a fairly unique sense in that they're building products that are used by people all over the world, and they're largely based in the United States. There's a few ways around that, though. One is this bill has pretty big penalties in it, up to 3% of global revenue. That is a pretty big stick, and it's similar, although a little bit less than what's been imposed in other jurisdictions. So one, you can penalize them. Two, we are not asking for very many things in this bill that aren't already being complied with in other jurisdictions. So the Online News Act was actually a little bit different. We were a bit ahead of the curve on that one.
Right.
And companies were kind of trying to set a precedent to stop us from doing it, or to stop other countries from following suit. This is a bit different. I mean, risk assessments are being asked for in the EU. Age-appropriate design codes are already in effect in the UK. These age restrictions are, to varying effect, present in Australia. So we're not first here. So the idea that this can't be done is a far more difficult argument. The final piece here is that this only applies, or will in very high likelihood apply, to the very large companies. So the large social media companies and the very large consumer-facing AI companies. And the costs to them of not complying are actually pretty high. Like, these are companies that are normalized in all aspects of our economy and our lives. And the cost of them just leaving the Canadian market, let alone the European market or the British market, are incredibly high. And I think broadly, there's a pretty high likelihood that this is going to set a new bar and they will comply.
Well, it's interesting on that, Taylor Owen, because we've had people on the show talking about this over the course of the last number of weeks, and Supriya Dwivedi, who you would know reasonably, she was on the show last night, and she made the point that a kid's feed in Europe is already better than a kid's feed here in Canada. It's going back to the minister's point that we're catching up with the other. So this getting to a higher collective standard is the trick in trying to make it enforceable on these global giants.
Yeah, and there's a tricky dynamic here where most of these kinds of regulations have to be done by the nation state. There aren't really any multilateral agreements or international organizations that can do this collectively. So it's a national endeavor. But we want to make sure that there's some degree of alignment between what each country is asking of these companies. And that just raises the bar of compliance, because these companies reasonably, I think, don't want to have entirely different rules for every jurisdiction. So as much as possible, I think Canada should be asking for similar things as other peer nations.
Right.
And this bill broadly does that. It pushes a couple of things forward, and that's how this works. A country tries things. Hopefully, we all learn from it. And then the next country that brings on a policy regime learns from it and iterates. And I think this is largely that. It is an iteration of what we know has worked and not worked in other jurisdictions.
Taylor Owen, founding director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy and associate professor of public policy at McGill University. We appreciate the time. Thank you, sir.
Anytime. See you soon.
Well, the federal government has laid out its plan to make social media safer for kids. It's called the Safe Social Media Act, and it aims to regulate social media services and chatbot services. Under this legislation, these platforms will have to meet 3 core duties: to protect children, to act responsibly, and for social media sites to make certain content inaccessible. That includes an obligation for those sites to implement an age restriction on accounts for children under 16 years old. Now, these new regulations will be enforced by a new Digital Safety Commission. And for more on this, I'm joined now by the Minister of Culture and Identity, Mark Miller, who joins me in the studio. Minister, good to see you. Thanks for racing over after your press conference. We appreciate you doing that.
Pleasure.
There is a fair amount there, and we carried your press conference live, so we've seen a lot of the discussion on that. But I have a couple of questions I hope you can help me with on specific things. The duty to immediately remove content, the sexual content, the non-consensual deep fakes and revenge porn, as people would call it, that's a no-brainer. I understand that completely. But is that the extent of what has to be taken down? You have these 7 other categories of harmful content: bullying a child, foments hatred, incites violence, terrorism. What is the strength of the law in getting these types of content off social media?
It's an extremely important question, David, because in all these things you struggle with the notion of hierarchy of rights.
Right.
In some of the most egregious situations, kiddie porn, non-consensual sharing of images, as you said, it's a no-brainer. These things shouldn't be up there. They should be taken down within 24 hours. The actual fact that they are up causes people to self-harm, causes the bullying that you referenced. It also, sadly, when a kid decides to die by suicide, it re-victimizes families that have to see this stuff shared forever. So it's important that that crap gets taken down. As to the other stuff, we could have a debate on what needs to be taken down. I think the importance of those 5 other categories of harms are that platforms will be responsible to take proper and adequate measures to reduce the exposure of kids in particular, but everyone, to that type of harm. It will impose safety by design requirements and platform requirements where the platforms themselves could remove it if they don't follow the user guidelines that'll be changed. As you noted earlier, there are other countries in Europe and Australia where a kid's experience online is notably better by the laws that have been passed and that we are admittedly catching up to. So there's a number of cascading effects that I think that'll be good as a part of this law. But when it comes to the most egregious expressions of harm, that crap needs to be taken down within 24 hours.
Okay, but I guess, it is subjective, I guess, if something foments hatred, right? Like, you can have an argument on it, or whether it incites violence, you can have an argument on it, right? And so is that why these are not as prescriptive as say, the other, like the intimate images restrictions?
Well, what we want to make sure is that, and again, these are very tight definitions that follow existing legislation that people can be sued under if they don't remove it, but you don't want to leave that responsibility necessarily in the harms of the victims after the damage is done. So the responsibility clearly on platforms is to make sure that those extreme occurrences are reduced and indeed, we hope, eliminated. But again, this is not an exercise in perfection. It's in moving the ball forward and making sure that people's experience online, particularly kids, is markedly better than it is today.
So the ban comes in place when the legislation passes the House of Commons, the Senate, and gets royal assent. Then there's a period of time where the regulations get established and then a regulator is set up. So there could be a gap where Facebook, for example, can't give accounts to people under the age of 16, may implement compliance methods, but has no regulator to go to. I mean, do you foresee that as a possibility to get the exemption to bring them back? I mean, do you see that as a possibility where there's a ban in place and no way to get around it, even if a company complies?
So strictly speaking, the law comes into force by a decision by the Government Council. Fully expect that to have that moratorium placed. The timeline is an aggressive one to get a commission up and running. It'll be phased. Obviously, a commission would be seized with the compliance discourse that has to happen with platforms, with AI chatbot services, but also compliance with the law. It's a dangerous game of chicken for platforms to arbitrage that and say, well, we'll just wait. There are plenty of laws out there that people break. Otherwise, we wouldn't have courts if the laws were perfect and everyone observed them. But we want, to your point, I think importantly, for these laws to be effective, and that's why the importance of the commission that'll be phased up into what I think is an aggressive time frame of about 18 months.
But I'm seeing a scenario where, no disrespect to government, but the tech companies may tend to move a bit faster. So they may move faster now with the broad signal you've given them on compliance more quickly than you can get the regulation set up and get the regulator set up so they can apply for the exemption to say, look, we've done the homework. Let's give us our ability to give kids accounts back.
Look, in the hopeful situation that platforms finally see where the puck is and start skating to it before it gets there, and government is catching up, I think they can forgive us a couple months. I am hopeful, and indeed the work starts now. Obviously, the law needs to pass. We need to have a discussion with parliamentarians, with the Senate, to make sure that it does pass, and with society. Obviously, we'll entertain any reasonable contribution that parliaments from any side of the party can have. But we want this to be in place as quickly as possible and for the law to be in effect. That will include the expectation that platforms start adjusting now and follow these very basic minimum duties to take down the most extreme garbage within 24 hours, act responsibly, and protect kids, which they're not doing now, and indeed in many states in particular, because damages are higher in certain particular states, are getting quite significantly sued for and losing.
So it starts with a ban on use to essentially force a compliance framework upon the companies, right? That you lose access to your future customers and current customers under the age of 16 without these changes to the content moderation principles, the way your algorithms work, the addictiveness of your platform, and just the fundamental concept of it to make it a safer space for everyone before you get the kids back. How did you land on that as opposed to just the blanket ban like we see in Australia or, an aggressive ban on specific types of content beyond the explicit ones that you've outlined here?
Well, first and foremost, we want kids' experience online to be much better than it is today, and harm in these 7 egregious categories to be significantly reduced. I think if we'd gone out with a ban and nothing else, people would have seen it for what it would be, which is something that would have real questions as to whether it's effective and its sufficiency, particularly in a context where we are catching up to a number of countries that we compare ourselves often favorably to, but not in this case. This is a Canadian law, so we did have to tailor it carefully to what the Canadian experience online is, where we are, who we are as a people, making sure we're respecting people's respect for privacy. Private messaging, for example, is excluded. Not that bullying can occur and often does occur on those services, but that for us was a bridge too far. We thought we needed to keep it very much focused on really the egregious harms that are occurring online, that are creating what we see is happening in hospitals, and really making sure that platforms have that very basic minimum responsibility to reduce what they're responsible for hosting.
Right, so it's harm reduction as opposed to harm elimination, you know, to sort of use, because it is difficult to police all the behavior that happens online, but I wonder about some of the more aggressive stuff that you see maybe in the public spaces of social media, moving to these exempt private spaces that you talk about, right? They can go into Discord, they can go, Roblox has become its own thing as my kids have played games there and they don't use that platform anymore, but the private messaging can become more the focus for some of this, right? This could be the next challenge you face here.
Yeah, and I think as a society and as a government, we have to look at what perhaps the unintended consequences of this law is, perhaps adapt the responsibility of the Commission, perhaps modify certain provisions for more flexibility. That is a process that will continue to be ongoing. I would venture to think that if this law had passed a year ago, it might not have had the robust compliance mechanisms that we are asking, and very basic mechanisms we are asking AI chatbot services to observe in the wake of Tumbler Ridge. So this is a fast evolving technology and space where technology is causing a ton of disruption.
Right.
But we believe that this type of law is a very basic minimum and can modestly keep up with it.
But I know you answered this in the press conference, but you're not including a duty to report sort of the behavior. We learned that the shooter in Tumbler Ridge was exploring options and advice on how to execute the plan in an AI chatbot. And you said there was a grievous human error failure on the reporting there. Like they had internal reporting out policies and it wasn't complied with. But making it a legal obligation gets around the reliance on tech companies to have internal policies, does it not? I just wonder, how close were you to doing that? Because it seems to me that is not an onerous obligation to put on these billion-dollar companies that when you see this type of behavior, alert the local authorities.
You know, when we discussed this as a government, we looked at what the obligation is for any person to report any crime, or where that reporting does exist, and frankly to consider the reality of what happened in Tumbler Ridge. AI did, in a sense, catch this. What that particular chatbot service did and said is still something of much analysis, but there was a real human failure here in the compliance group of OpenAI. And that reporting, while the mechanism was in place to have that discussion with police, did not reach the threshold that it would today if they had used the same standards that OpenAI uses. What we have decided and settled on is a mandatory transparency mechanism where we ask platforms and AI chatbot services to report the incidents that they're seeing, report what their standard is of reporting to the police, how many times that has occurred, and what that actual standard is, and how many times it's been used. So essentially it gets to that in a less direct way, but creates a compliance mechanism where we're saying to the public, look, this is the service you're using, this is what they have to do when they see an egregious event and who they have to report it to. And we feel that ecosystem does address a number of the challenges that we're seeing out there.
So God forbid a repeat of the behavior that preceded what happened at Tumbler Ridge shows up in the OpenAI chatbot again. Under these rules, they will call the police, they will contact the police, or they will publish it in a sort of like anonymized, cataloging of the number of complaints like issues like this that they see.
You know, if you were to ask the OpenAI folks today, based on the standard that they have, whether they would have caught this incident based on their legal standard of imminence, the answer would be yes. I think the jump that we can't make is that any particular act or gesture would have absolutely prevented this catastrophe from happening, but I know that a law like this in place will significantly reduce the harm that kids are exposed to. In the case of AI chatbots, make sure that any counseling that's occurring from those AI chatbots to people that perhaps are in a very difficult situation is safe by design. And the compliance groups within these heavily capitalized companies have a robust mechanism of reporting and address that issue of being able to flag the police when these events occur.
So just as a final question, because I've gone over time here, but the penalties are 3% of global turnover, the revenue, or $10 million, whichever is greater. And you can see in the concept of an OpenAI or whatever, you're getting into large numbers. But the overall ability to enforce that, like there would have to be a legal process to get the assets, because I'm sure they're not stored in Canada, right? You can't go get a sheriff's officer to go put a lien on it. And just, you know, if an AI chatbot or a social media company decides, fine, we'll give up the under 16 market in Canada, we're not going to comply. Do you geo-block those somehow? Do you firewall them from being accessed from inside Canada? How do you deal with the total non-compliers from having access to this market necessarily if they're not going to comply?
Well, one, if they want to have access to the market, they will have to comply. The Commission will, unfortunately, probably have to deal with some of these situations. In terms of executing, there are plenty of laws where a number of these well-capitalized companies exist where you can actually enforce, and there's that reciprocity that exists.
Right.
You don't want it to get to that. First and foremost, is a regime to prevent and to reduce the harm that's occurring. And indeed, people aren't in Canada with platforms and OpenAI necessarily as a charitable act. They're there to make money, and if they want revenue from Canadians, they need to comply with our law.
Mark Miller, Minister of Canadian Identity and Culture. I don't think this will be our last interview on this topic. We appreciate you coming in on the day that you're rolling it all out. We appreciate it, sir.
Thank you, Dave.
All right, still to come, we're going to take a quick break, but the U.S. President says he's not interested necessarily in renewing CUSMA. And the Prime Minister says the opening of a bridge between Canada and the U.S. could be delayed. Just another day on that file. We're going to talk about the potential trouble for Canada with the Power Rankings panel next. Well, U.S. President Donald Trump is once again suggesting he isn't interested in renewing CUSMA.
Well, I'm not looking to renew it. I don't, I mean, I made the deal, and the primary reason I made the deal is that NAFTA was the worst trade deal I've ever seen. Yeah. And I made it better, but I had the right to terminate. USMCA did one thing that I loved. After 6 years, it comes up for renewal. I don't know that I'm going to renew it because, to be honest with you, the United States does much better. Hey, we don't need anything that Canada has. We don't need anything that Mexico has, but they need everything that we have. And they have to treat us better.
4.2% inflation might suggest otherwise, but all of this comes as the Prime Minister says the Gordie Howe International Bridge opening could be delayed after saying it would open later this week.
Everyone's working hard to make sure the bridge is open as soon as possible. There's no big drama. If it takes a little longer, it'll take a little longer, but this will benefit Canadians, Americans, business, tourists, residents for decades and decades to come.
All right, our Power Rankings panel is here to talk about this and more. Jonathan Kalis was a Quebec advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Rachel Siegel is a former Director of Policy in the Stephen Harper government. And here with me is Anne McGrath, who is a former National Director of the New Democratic Party. Okay, Rachel, I want to start with you because all of this is connected to your down pick today on the Canada-U.S. front. Which element, the bridge we built but can't get over, or the whole CUSMA thing?
Well, my down is, if you remember, a week ago today, or maybe it was yesterday, we were watching Dominique LeBlanc come out in Washington and talk about being eternally optimistic around the relationship between Canada and the United States. So my down is that eternal optimism. I can't believe a week later we're at a point where, Donald Trump is putting a hard line down on CUSMA. The bridge won't open, and the line for the Prime Minister is that it's going to take a little longer. It's something we talk about constantly, but I think the down here is also the message to Canadians. I mean, how long will this take? And the uncertainty around the economy, inflation, etc. And there's a lot at stake for Canadians. I mean, it's $1.3 billion in trade. That's nothing to sneeze at. So not a good week for the Canada-U.S. relationship.
Okay, I have a little bit of information I want to throw on the table of what the Prime Minister and Dominique LeBlanc told the premiers today, because they had a meeting today at 1 o'clock, and I was able to glean some stuff. The Prime Minister told the premiers they're getting some traction on some smaller issues, but not on the big ones, on the Section 232 tariffs, steel, aluminum, autos, that are still problematic, but this is mostly talking to Jameson Greer. Those are issues for the President. The comment today about not renewing CUSMA is seen as not necessarily a new comment, something he has said before. It's news because he's the President. There are 36 issues outstanding between Canada and the United States, and Dominique LeBlanc told the premiers that in the meeting on Monday, they resolved 12 of those. So that leaves 24 issues to still be unresolved. A lot of them are common with what's happening with Mexico. For example, rules of origin, transshipment through China and other non-market economies. Some of them are booze bans at the LCBO, for example. But that's broadly where they are, Jono. One thing that really jumped out at me, though, Jonathan, is that the Americans have indicated they don't want this to end up in their Congress. They want to keep this at the executive level, which it would go to Congress if you pulled out of CUSMA entirely, and who knows what's going to happen in Congress in the midterms, right? Because you lose your ability to do things there. So it's likely to persist at this high-level conversation for the foreseeable future. So that's a little bit of insight I got. So I just wanted to throw it on the table. So go ahead. Your thoughts, John, on Rachel's pick.
So that adds some color, but, I don't know if we say that we're eternally optimistic if we mean it. But on the other hand, I don't think that Donald Trump saying that, today he doesn't need CUSMA and we don't need anything Canada has, when we talk about the trade imbalance just from natural resources flowing south. Again, is this really any different than the bluster we've heard for the last 17 months? I don't think so. So I don't know if I would be less or more optimistic. I don't know if it'd be up or down based on Donald Trump's comments of the day. I think this is par for the course. I think the good news is there is some progress. And I don't think we had a lot of progress early this year. After the October demise in the Reagan ad, I don't think much movement happened for a number of months. Now they're talking. Maybe they're talking about talking, but they're moving, and we're not going to hear about it in the public sphere. So, okay, this is where we're at. And I agree with the fundamental principle. A bad deal is worse than no deal. Uncertainty is terrible, but I'd rather have the uncertainty than a bad deal. So this is where we're at. We're going to continue to be here.
Yeah, and the fact that, 12 of 36 issues, and who knows, the order of magnitude of these, what I understand is some of them are quite small potatoes that the U.S. has put on the table. But this adds credence to what Janice Charette had said Tuesday of last week, that we're not waiting for formal talks to start resolving issues. We're doing things as we go. But still, here we are.
And are those 12 really resolved when the president hasn't weighed in on it, right?
That is the question.
Are they really resolved? And I think, honestly, I think that we are all grasping at little glimmers of optimism that we can find here and there, and we don't know if there is any reason to be optimistic about things. I don't think that we can trust anything that comes out of the United States right now that has to go through the president. I just think it is completely this is the guy who has been saying for how many months now that we're this close to resolving the Iran war.
Any day now.
Any day now. We have no reason to be optimistic, and we have lots of reason to be pessimistic.
Yeah. Yes, the unreliable narrator concept is very, very much at play here. So, Jono, this kind of plays into your pick. You have down for the G7 summit, which is set to start on Monday of next week in France. A trip I will not be hosting next week because I'm going on this trip to cover it as a reporter. Why is this a down for you? It's an up for me. I get to go to the French Alps.
Well, I would go to France with you. That would be an up, but it's a down because I'm not going. It's my expectations are down.
Yeah.
I don't expect some big communique at the end. There'll probably be some individual communiques. They have Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE are going as invited countries. Are they going to resolve the Middle East war now? Is Donald Trump going to leave in the middle? These are all very serious possibilities. They're supposed to be talking about online harms and things like that. Are they going to resolve anything? Is Donald Trump going to stand up for his big tech? What's going to be, I think it would be more interesting if we had a polymarket plan of what's going to blow up the G7 rather than is it going to be successful?
Yeah, and we're back more to a G6 plus Trump. Than the sort of the G7 concept that has existed throughout the decades.
And I think that there are some expectations that this will be like the next step from the Davos speech. This is like the middle powers coming together. I think that they would do well to temper any expectations. I think Jono's right. There's not much is going to come out of this, and what they need to do is downplay, I think, the significance of this, because otherwise people will be incredibly disappointed.
Well, Rachel, we already told in the briefing for people going on the trip not to expect a communique or any of this, a unanimity on things. There may be some individual statements on stuff, but if you look at the countries that Jonathan mentioned, and then you look at the other invitees, India, Brazil, Kenya, South Korea, them plus the G7, they're getting devastated economically by this battle in Iran, and Donald Trump's a key player in that. So, what are your thoughts on expectations for the G7?
Well, I think for me, what's making me even more nervous is the trips around the G7. So Prime Minister Carney will also be visiting other countries, which we anticipate will be about trade talks. And on one hand, yeah, exactly. And on one hand, that's great because it sends a strong message that Canada can diversify, and that's a message that he really has been putting forward over the last little while. But the problem is, as we've seen in the last couple of things that we've talked about, the dynamic with Donald Trump is that he gets set off at anything. So how does he go and on these trade missions and then sit at the G7 with Donald Trump? We don't know what's going to set him off. And when we look at our economy and the ties and the trade that we're doing with Europe versus the United States, I mean, the hope is that that trade with Europe would increase, but in no way are we ever going to be at the point that we're at with the United States in terms of trade, security, just geography. And so I think it's a fine line for Mark Carney, and I'm glad I'm not the one walking it.
Mark Carney, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, all of them, right? Everyone is going to be on a tightrope at the G7 because it's just the way these forums work now. And your pick today is government complacency. I'm assuming you mean the federal government complacency on childcare and things like that?
Federal and provincial to some extent
Okay.
also, but I think that the federal government has a big role to play in this. Like, childcare was a centerpiece of the government that this government doesn't want to be connected to. And I am worried that it will wither and die if it is not, given some care and nurturing. And I don't see any champions right now in the Liberal government for this. And it is hugely significant. Like, we were just talking about diversification of the economy. Pretty hard to diversify and grow our economy without a strong workforce. And that strong workforce includes women with children. And so I think, we all know that good childcare is good for kids. It's good for families. It is really important. There was so much fanfare around it. And I just worry that they're just going to let it kind of, fade away. And I think it needs to be brought back up into the public consciousness and into the front and center of the government. And to do that, we need some champions in the government.
As I was making my phone calls today to find out what's going on at the First Minister's meeting, there was buzz of clarity on childcare potentially coming soon. I don't know what that means. Clarity can be good and it can be bad, and so I'm not putting a thumb on the scale either way. I don't know. But Rachel, what are your thoughts on this? Because we have some rollover agreements with some provinces to keep the funding going as they work out a longer-term framework, and some provinces saying the federal share isn't enough to make it all work and get to the $10 a day standard.
Well, let me tell you, I'm a mom with 2 young children who are sitting in a province that had a head start on this issue in 2017 when the NDP came in British Columbia on this issue specifically. Now, 94% of parents can't access $10 a day childcare in British Columbia. So much so that the province of BC actually put this on hold, the creation of more $10 a day childcare spaces in the 2026 budget. So we're at a standstill here in British Columbia with no hope that anything's going to get better, and 6% of families that have won the lottery when it comes to childcare. So kudos to Anne. I fully agree, and hopefully that is something the Premier spoke about today.
Okay, Jono, your thoughts on this one? We got about 45 seconds left, then we're going to lose the show.
I'm sitting in Quebec, so we've had $8, $10 a day daycare for almost 30 years, 28 years. So we were well ahead. We're very happy to take the federal check to offset the cost. But in Quebec, it's been a success story. We can see it. Just the number of women in the workforce increased so dramatically. It increased the GDP of Quebec. And so, I hope that the rest of the provinces can figure it out. But you know what? The provinces are also going to have to own part of this and not just wait for a handout. They need to be much more proactive because it's good for the economy.
Exactly.
Yes, I remember the last year both of my kids were in childcare, and $10 a day. I could have bought a Honda Civic with cash with what I paid to put them in childcare for the year. We got to leave it there. Rachel Siegel, Jonathan Kalis, Anne McGrath, thank you all. Sorry about the compressed time frame, but we had the digital safety stuff we really needed to cover. Thank you all for watching. I'm David Cochran. Thank you for watching Power and Politics. I'm away tomorrow and into next week because I am traveling with the Prime Minister to France, Ireland, and the G7, which will also be in France. I'll be appearing on the show reporting from there. Hannah Mansing Tonight is up next here on CBC News Network. See you soon again.